The man's literally out here having an existential crisis, and that's it. That's the movie. Literally, it's just 90 minutes of him going, what is a woman? What is truth? What is reality? Who am I? Do trans people deserve rights? Hi everyone. So in today's video, I want to take a look at this documentary called What is a Woman? Starring Matt Walsh from the Daily Wire. Matt Walsh is a conservative political commentator currently sitting at over 1 million subscribers on YouTube. He's a part of the right-wing news outlet, the Daily Wire, consisting of other conservative pundits like Michael Knowles, Candace Owens, as of recently Jordan Peterson, and of course, yours truly, the Benny Boy.
Wet ass P-word.
The documentary is presented as this one man's worldwide journey, the quest of finding the truth of what is this mystical enigma that is woman. But soon, as you'll see, it delves into blatant anti-trans propaganda, full-on tirade against trans people, in particular trans women. It was released on 1st of June of this year, so right on Pride Month. Very controversial. Now, I am not trans. However, since its release, I haven't seen much videos online trying to refute or debunk the arguments made in this documentary. So far, I've mostly seen other right-wing reactionaries covering this. I think partly the reason for this is because it is only available on the Daily Wire website, where you have to pay $14 to watch. So thankfully, it is not widely accessible to everyone, although I was able to find a free version online. Secondly, it is an entire 90 minutes of gish-galloping anti-trans arguments. Gish-gallop refers to presenting an excessive amount of fallacious and flawed arguments within a short period of time. This is not just with this documentary in particular, but many conservative media, when analysed, it can be found that a lot of them use this technique. The aim of gish-galloping is to present so many poor arguments all in one go that it ends up overwhelming your opponent. So by the time you get your head around one of the arguments and go, hang on, that doesn't sound right, and think of ways to refute it, by that point you're presented with 10 or so more arguments that are just as flawed, and you don't even know where to start. In this video, I will try to go through some of these arguments. Keyword try. The documentary begins with a kid's birthday party for Matt Walsh's twin children, one boy and a girl.
Being a dad is one of the great privileges of my life.
Yeah, that is definitely the face of a proud father, of someone who does not regret his decisions at all. Sure, but right off the bat, we're presented with this rigid gender binary. It is emphasized how different the kids are from each other despite being twins. The boy is gifted a football, a gun, and seems super excited about it as he hangs around with his guy friends, all of whom are wearing blue for some reason. And the girl gets this pink fluffy tiara thing as she hangs out with her girlfriends having a tea party, all of whom are wearing pink for some reason. Hell, even the cake is divided up in two regions because, get it? Two genders, blue space and pink flowers. Now, some of you might disagree with this, but I don't have an issue with people expressing their gender in a way that might be considered traditional if that is what feels right to them. I personally wouldn't, if I'm being completely honest. This level of cis heteronormativity makes me quite uncomfortable. But the kids seem pretty happy. No one seems to be pressuring them into behaving a certain way, at least in this scene. And I don't really have anything to say to that. I am fully accepting of anyone expressing their gender in a way that is true to them, even when it adheres to the status quo. However, I know for a fact that people like Matt Walsh would not be accepting of someone like me. Instead, they would insist that I fit into this gender binary, put me in a box, even if that is the last thing I would ever want to do. And that is where I have a problem. Matt Walsh then goes into a bit of a rant about the worms, which if it wasn't in the context of this documentary, you would think it's coming straight out of some red-pilled, alpha-mailed, gym rat podcaster's mouth. You know, Matt Walsh, the reasonable of the reasonables, even he struggles to understand the nature of the females. In fact, forget understanding women. What even is a woman?
I like to make sense of things. But making sense of females is a whole other matter. Forget trying to figure out women. The real question is, what is a woman?
And thus embarks the journey of one lone traveler, the truth seeker, of finding answer to one essential question, the truth, as long as it fits in his worldview, as he travels the world, and by world I mean the US and like one African country, as he seeks out his answer. This portion of the documentary was infuriating to watch. Like, when I was watching this for the first time, I was legit fuming because he interviews all these incredible qualified people who provide him with such sophisticated answers. He interviews a therapist, a surgeon, a doctor, a college professor. Like, I found myself nodding along to a lot of these people. Like, yeah, that makes sense. That's really interesting. Yet, every time he gets an answer that he doesn't like, that isn't straightforward, that doesn't fit in with his worldview, he just dismisses it completely. He's like, yeah, I'm not gonna listen to you. 2 seconds later, why can't no one tell me what a woman is? In fact, when interviewing this college professor, he literally cuts him off, doesn't even show the entire interview, presents him as this complicated, convoluted, clueless professor who doesn't even have the answer to this simple question.
We've got gender and sex, right?
Yeah.
What's the difference between the two? Is there a difference?
I saw that in your questions and I thought, my goodness, this is what we spend an entire semester kind of thinking through. But what we tend to think about in the social sciences today is that sex refers to a set of biological characteristics and gender is a social construct or category. What I think is often misleading about that characterization is allowed to be sort of messy and complicated. But in that framing, when you split them up into these wholly discrete constructs, studies scholars, and really more specifically people who study gender and sex, we're not talking about sexuality right now. In the kind of academic universe that I travel in is that we see how deeply gendered ideas, cultural ideas about masculinity and femininity, maleness and femaleness, both in humans and in lots of other animals.
This professor may actually have answered his question, but we wouldn't know that. Because Matt Walsh isn't really here to listen. He would much rather listen to the owner of this dinky-ass Star Wars shop, because that aligns more with his worldview.
How do you know that you're a man?
How do I know that I'm a, I guess because I got a dick.
And would you believe me if I were to tell you that this is literally the first hour of this documentary? Matt Walsh claims he wants to know the truth, that he wants to listen, yet every time someone tries to talk to him, present ideas that challenges the status quo ever so slightly, you may as well be speaking to a brick wall. He plays the victim when people realize what is truly going on, that he isn't really here to listen, that he's in bad faith, and decides to leave the conversation, which they have every right to do. Then he plays the broken record. Why does no one listen to me? Is there anyone? Please tell me what a woman is!
Well, now I can say I've been to college. Glad I didn't pay for it. Is there anyone willing to give me a straight answer?
Like, the secondhand embarrassment is too much to bear. He at one point goes to this women's march and borderline harasses women.
Please, if one person could tell me what a woman is.
To his credit, at one point, he does leave his US bubble and visit this tribe called Maasai in Kenya. Initially, I was pretty excited to watch this part of the documentary because despite what most people seem to believe, Gender fluidity and non-binary identities are hardly a new thing. Historically, there are many cultures and nations that did and still do acknowledge that there is at least a third gender. There is two-spirited people among Native Americans, Hijra in South Asia that are legally recognized as a gender identity, Takatabui, which refers to the LGBT plus community of the Maori tribe, who are the indigenous Polynesian people of New Zealand, and for Aboriginal Australians, we have sister girls referring to trans women and brother boys referring to trans men. But out of all these identities, Matt Walsh chose to go with the one that, you guessed it, fits in with his worldview, the one that laughed off even at the concept of being non-binary. Based on this one group alone, Matt Walsh makes the conclusion that
It's clear that gender ideology is a uniquely Western phenomenon.
As a side note, the Maasai tribe that Matt Walsh interviewed is one of the tribes in Africa that are known for practicing female circumcision, even on girls that are as young as 10 years old. Now, this practice have been slowing down, thankfully, but I do find it interesting how, throughout the documentary, Matt Walsh claims his concern with the gender-critical discourse is due to its impact on children. They start off by introducing his children, his worries about them growing up in a world where gender and identity is fluid.
And now our culture is telling us that the differences between girls and boys don't matter. That if you identify as something, then you are that thing. How do we help our kids make sense of this when they're bombarded with conflicting messages about gender and identity?
So, it's an odd choice for someone that cares about children that much to go with the Maasai tribe, portray them as some sort of a utopia where everyone has a strong sense of their identity, even though they're known for mutilating young girls, forcing them off to marriage at a young age. Certainly something I wouldn't expect from someone who is such a huge advocate for children to promote. The rest of the documentary just dives into anti-trans propaganda. It is your same old transphobic talking points that I'm sure we've all heard of at some point or another. So for the remainder of this video, I kind of want to briefly go through some of these points. I mean, there is at least an attempt of arguments that I can go over instead of 1 hour of Matt Walsh going, haha, you don't know what a woman is, haha, oh, you do? No, I'm not gonna listen to you. 1. Kinsey and Money. The documentary then delves into how this so-called Western phenomena of gender and sexual identities came to fruition and attributes it to two scientists, Alfred Kinsey and John Money. John Money is infamously known for his John Joanne case in the mid-1960s, where he hypothesized that gender and gender identities are mostly nurture than nature, and believed that your biological sex had little to do with your gender. To test out his theory, Money reached out to the Reimer family, who had two twin boys. After one of the twins, Bruce Reimer, experienced significant damage to his genitalia due to a failed circumcision at 8 months old, Money convinced the parents to help raise Bruce as a girl. He forcibly performed gender reassignment surgeries, gave hormone replacement therapy, and made him go by a different name to live his life as a girl. However, Bruce was never able to accept his female identity. He suffered from severe depression, had trouble fitting in at school, and eventually decided to transition back as a man and change his name to David Reimer. As an adult, David spoke out against Money.
The girls would do their things with their Barbies and things like that, and that wouldn't interest me. And things such as trucks and building forts and, getting to the odd fist fight and climbing trees. That's the kind of stuff that I like, but it was unacceptable, so I'd never...
As a girl?
As a girl, I had no place to fit in.
But eventually ended up taking his life at 38 after battling with severe depression. While the case of the Reimers is tragic, I hope this goes without saying how this deeply flawed, unethical experiment has barely anything to do with trans issues today. When this case is brought up when arguing against trans rights, the argument usually goes in the form of Money invented gender identity back in the 60s, carried out unethical and abusive acts under its name, therefore the current research on this topic is invalid. Yeah, that doesn't really hold up. It is practically just guilt by association. The thing is, Money's research has been discredited ever since, especially after David began to speak out. In 1997, an academic study was published criticizing Money's work. Even Rolling Stone published an article covering this in the same year. Everyone pretty much forgot about John Money until conservatives and right-wing reactionaries decided to dig him up to promote gender essentialist ideas. Gender essentialism, very simply put, it's this idea that gender is determined from birth. This theory suggests that there are innate, essential, unchangeable qualities that make males and females behave a certain way, which is completely at odds with the idea that gender is a social construct. Many academics have discredited this theory, and there are a lot of research that looks into how it promotes pretty sexist ideas. If anything, Money's John Doan case proves how having a gender identity that misaligns with your biological sex can lead to severe psychological distress. What was done to David Reimer is not what being trans is about. David was forced into transition as a female, and the issues that he dealt with as a result, severe depression, extreme discomfort with his gender, suicidal ideation, these are all obvious signs of gender dysphoria that some trans people experience. The next key figure that this documentary presents is Alfred Kinsey. Kinsey was a sexologist who performed research regarding sexual behavior in the 50s. Without going into too much detail, some of his work was fraudulent as it involved performing sexual acts on children and babies. His data was collected from convicted sex offenders and child molesters.
But instead of suffering the consequences for his heinous actions, he was and still is celebrated by academia and Hollywood. His ideas form the foundation for sexual education in public schools today.
That is simply not true. In fact, I was able to look this up in less than a minute. There are not just scientific articles, but news articles that call out Kinsey on his heinous crimes. There is a document available online that even outlines the evidence of criminal acts that Kinsey and his researchers were convicted of. There are documentaries available on YouTube that you can watch. But to equate modern sex education with what Kinsey did over 70 years ago is such a stretch of an argument that I don't even know how to address it. Like, what are you even trying to say? Trans people, trans women are predators because of Kinsey? If that is really the argument that you're going for, then it is pretty counterintuitive to even engage, because my not involved with human trafficking t-shirt has people asking a lot of questions already answered by my shirt. 2. Trans women in women's sports. Don't you just love it when the only time people seem to care about women's sports is when it comes to a trans women? I mean, it is a well-documented fact that women's sports are severely underfunded and receive a fraction of the media coverage to men's sports. But the moment we have a trans woman wanting to participate in women's sports, whom these transphobes wouldn't even consider to be a real woman, oh no, now everyone is concerned about women's sports all of a sudden. I wonder why that is. The section for trans athletes participating in women's sports starts off by presenting the case of the Connecticut trans track athletes who absolutely dominated every division of track and field they participated in. The documentary tries to take this approach that, oh, they clearly have a biological advantage since they were born male, which completely falls apart when they speak to this trans activist who explains that actually the case for those athletes were an exception. Usually trans athletes don't win or excel that much compared to cisgender athletes, which negates any possibilities of them having some sort of an unfair advantage.
No, it's not indicative of an unfair advantage. And I think part of the proof of this is that more transgender girls are coming out in high school and still playing sports, and they're not winning. You know, the Connecticut case is the exception. It got a lot of attention because those two trans girls performed well, but there are many more trans girls competing in sports and they don't excel.
But then they followed it up by showing a montage of trans athletes performing and winning at women's sports, receiving wide media coverage, almost trying to subtly disprove any of the points made. Hopefully this goes without saying that Just because something gets a lot of media attention does not always mean that it is happening more frequently. In fact, I would argue that the reason trans athletes get such a large media coverage, especially when they win, is because they are an exception. The same goes for any minority groups, say young people, for example. Every time there is a 14 or a 15-year-old young athlete participating in elite sports, it is widely covered in the media. Now, does that mean that the vast majority of Olympian athletes are 15-year-olds? No. The documentary takes an emotional turn as they interview two girls who are absolutely disheartened, who feel as if their opportunities have been stripped away from them because of these trans athletes. I guess their overarching argument is that it's not fair. It's not fair that cis female athletes have to compete with trans athletes who have a different genetic makeup to them. However, some of you are going to hate me for saying this, but there are a lot of things in sports that are unfair. Women's sports get far less favored compared to the men's sports, as I mentioned. Class differences among athletes can create an unfair advantage. As much as we love a rags to riches story, the fact of the matter is that athletes who come from wealthy and privileged backgrounds have better access to resources, which allows them to have better performances. Your physical traits like your height can give you an advantage in some sports like basketball. Levels of testosterone, which although this documentary doesn't mention, is usually brought up when discussing trans female athletes. However, there are plenty of cis female athletes who have a higher level of testosterone, especially those suffering from polycystic ovary syndrome or PCOS, which is common among elite female athletes. Historically, black female athletes were discriminated against as their bodies naturally produced higher levels of testosterone. None of this is new. If you're someone who follows elite sports, you may already know about a lot of this. Unfairness in sports, to some extent, is almost inevitable. However, when it comes to trans or intersex athletes, we seem to pick and choose what forms of unfairness is acceptable and what isn't. Caster Semenya is a South African middle distance runner who currently holds the titles of 2 Olympic gold medals and 3 world championships in women's 800 meters. In 2009, after she ran an 800-meter race almost too well, people began to suspect that she may actually be a man. This led to a series of degrading sex testing practices that Caster was forced to undertake, something that is still occurring in some parts of the US, revealing that Caster had normally high levels of testosterone in her blood. She was then told that she either needs to take hormone-lowering agents or surgeries if she wishes to continue her career as an athlete. However, when it came to someone like Michael Phelps, who has an abnormally large wingspan, double-jointed ankles giving him a greater range when swimming, lower concentration of lactic acid in his blood which causes him to fatigue less when compared to other athletes, there were virtually no discussions of him possessing any unfair advantage. No one wanted him to get surgeries to shorten his wingspan, get rid of the double joint in his ankles, or even take medications to boost his lactic acid levels. Instead, his unique traits were celebrated. Articles after articles were written saying how he was so naturally gifted and how his body was made for a swimmer. Now, Caster is not a trans woman. She is actually intersex. Even though she was assigned female at birth, she possesses the XY chromosomes. So with that, your thought pattern may be, okay, then why not split up athletes based on chromosomes? But then soon, you run into a different dilemma. This is Mac Briggs. Mac Briggs is a transgender wrestler who constantly gets dragged online as someone who is destroying women's sports. But the thing is, Mac is not a trans woman. He is a trans man. This man is literally doing what transphobes want him and athletes like him to do, which is to participate in the sports division that aligns with his biological sex. Yet, because he keeps winning, they have to twist the story around and portray him as a trans woman. Well, what now? What can be done? Before we get into some suggestions, I think it's important to go over why sex segregation in sports even exists in the first place. Your first thought maybe is that, well, men do tend to be on average stronger and faster than women, so it makes sense to divide them up so that it is fair for women. Well, you would be correct to an extent, but that doesn't explain sex segregation in sports that require very little physical output. In something like chess, for example, which I know some of you are probably rolling your eyes at my suggestion to even call it a sport, but bear with me. But in chess, where there barely is any physical effort required, there is still a sex segregation that is enforced. I think people tend to forget that when elite sports like Olympics were first invented in the 1800s, only men were allowed to participate. By the time feminism and women's rights caught up and allowed women to participate, the men had a huge head start in terms of advances to sports sciences and other opportunities. So they not only have a biological advantage, but also a sociological one. Going back to the chess example, say in a tournament, if you had 1,000 men participating versus only 100 women, the odds are that the men would be more likely to outperform women simply because they outnumbered them. But the good news is, currently, women's sports science is advancing. Now, I'm not saying that it is just as advanced as the men's, but it does seem to be catching up. This year, the ratio of male to female athletes in Olympics went nearly 50-50. With that in mind, I think it will be best to get rid of sex segregation altogether and instead divide up the athletes based on the sport-specific attributes instead. In something like weightlifting, for instance, it makes much more sense to have the athletes be divided in various weight ranges than sex, similar to what happens in boxing. Maybe trans and intersex athletes could get their own division, and Michael Phelps with his albatross wingspan could compete with other albatross wingspans. This is similar to what happens in Paralympics, where the athletes are sometimes divided based on their disabilities rather than sex. Finally, the last thing I want to point out is, all this discourse surrounding trans athletes seem to occur only when they win. I'm certain that if Castus Minor or Mac Briggs or even those track athletes from Connecticut were just your mediocre second or third place athletes, we wouldn't even be discussing this right now. It seems that most people are okay with trans athletes participating but not winning. But as the number of trans athletes in sports increase, it is inevitable that they would end up winning at some things. When people say that they do not want trans women participating in women's sports, oftentimes they fail to approach this topic with depth and nuance. What sports in particular are we talking about? What biological differences exactly that we are concerned of? Because a lot of these so-called unfair advantages that trans women seemingly possessed apply to many cis women too, as we've discussed. But when it is only brought up in the context of trans athletes to deny them certain positions and powers in society, that sounds like good old transphobia to me. 3. The bathroom problem. I have a genuine question for anyone who is still watching this. When was the last time you actually saw someone else's private parts when using a bathroom? While most of these transphobic talking points target both trans men and women, the bathroom argument seems to be explicitly targeted towards trans women, as the argument usually goes that allowing trans women who are biologically male to use women's restrooms would open up doors for predators to invade women's spaces and assault women. This has led to legislations to be passed in North Carolina in 2016 under the Trump administration, which forced transgender people to use bathrooms that match their biological sex, which was retracted in 2019. Since then, many procedures similar to this were introduced, but most have not progressed. This discussion surrounding the policing of someone else's right to use bathrooms based on their biological sex is so interesting to me because recently I've read a book called Female Masculinity that accounts the lived experiences of more butch masculine women, and it included an entire section on the bathroom problem, where it went on to say, in public bathrooms for women, Various bathroom users tend to fail to measure up to expectations of femininity, and those of us who present in some ambiguous way are routinely questioned and challenged about our presence in the wrong bathroom. The author Jack Halberstam, who was assigned female at birth but presents himself as more masculine, has routinely been called the security on him when using women's bathrooms, to the point he has grown accustomed to it. While doing research for this portion of the video, I also found several anecdotes from women who have been glared at, questioned, and even dragged out of women's bathrooms. Mind you, these are women, cis women who are unable to perform appropriate measures of femininity and or present themselves as more on the androgynous side, yet they are being policed and persecuted for using women's bathrooms. This, to me, says that the policing in women's bathrooms is based more on your gender expression. Therefore, all these bathroom bills that attempt to gatekeep who can and can't use bathrooms based on their biological sex and the gender that they were assigned on their birth certificate seems redundant, especially when none of the school districts that have implemented non-discrimination laws to protect trans people experienced any issues regarding assault and harassment. Yet, Matt Walsh framed this whole argument as an issue of concern of women's safety and their right to privacy.
Because we hear a lot about, well, gender nonconforming people, transgender people, it makes them feel bad if they're not given access to the bathrooms they want. Well, okay, so they have their feelings. What about the feelings of the girls who are getting raped? There are many girls and many women who are speaking out and saying, we want privacy in our facilities. We don't want a man in the bathroom with us. The transgender people, the gender nonconforming people, it's their feelings that take priority.
But in the documentary, they don't provide any statistics or cite any research. Instead, they mention like 2 cases where women were assaulted in the public bathrooms and footage of, oh no, it's people fighting. But when I went ahead and researched this, I found the opposite to be true. According to one of the largest surveys taken of transgender people in the United States, almost 60% have avoided using public restrooms for fear of confrontation, saying they have been harassed and assaulted. Even in female masculinity, Halberstam accounts experiences of women who constantly have to decide whether they can use public bathrooms in fear of their safety, some going as far as holding it in for hours until they find a bathroom that is safe for them to use. It is important to note that this is an issue not just about bathrooms or feelings, as Matt Walsh calls it. It is about limiting trans visibility in public. Because think about it. When you have limited access to bathrooms that you can use out in public, you have to plan out your entire journey according to what bathrooms are available. You have to be wary of how much you would eat or drink when you're out and about, and these inconveniences may even hinder you from going out in public. While I fully understand the concerns some women may have when sharing bathrooms, because trust me, I wouldn't want to share a bathroom with a predator either, the issue of women's safety from assault and harassment extends far beyond bathrooms and women's spaces. So it feels strange to target this out of all things, especially when it conveniently maligns trans people. Without trying to dismiss the cases of Loudoun County and Wiesbaden, which were the 2 cases that the documentary brought up, assault in women's bathrooms is unfortunately nothing new and has been happening even before trans activism became mainstream. In fact, there are more Republican legislators who have been arrested for misconduct in bathrooms than trans people. Hell, even the former US president have been alleged to barge into dressing rooms, someone Matt Walsh has openly endorsed before. Where were you then, Matt? Where was your concern for women's safety and privacy then? 4. Pronouns. In early last year, when the Loudoun County School Board introduced its new transgender student policy that requires teachers to address students by their chosen pronouns and use the restroom associated with their gender identity, some teachers objected to that and decided to sue the school board. The documentary goes ahead and actually interviews some of these teachers.
I can't lie to children, and I got to also represent a whole community that believes in biological facts and scientific facts. And I can't do that to kids.
Out of all the transphobic talking points, the refusal to use someone else's preferred pronouns is probably my least favorite because it seems to be rooted in sheer pettiness masked as a concern for truth and biology. Matt Walsh's distant cousin Ben Shapiro is one of the people who are vehemently against using your preferred pronouns.
I'm the editor of a pretty major site, and my basic rule is that when we're discussing people who are trans, we immediately say in the first paragraph trans woman and then refer to them by their biological pronoun because biology is the nature of the pronoun.
The argument usually goes that trans women are not biologically women, therefore using she, her pronouns to refer to a trans woman is incorrect because biology is the nature of pronouns. Now, I will agree that trans women are not biologically female as there will be some biological differences between a cis woman and a trans woman. However, there is also a social aspect to being a woman, since most trans women live their lives as women, experience life as a woman, even fulfill the societal roles of a woman. Therefore, socially, they are just as much of a woman as a cis woman. A good analogy to describe this is the role of adoptive parents versus biological parents. While in some circumstances, like when determining a child's risk of developing some hereditary diseases, it is important to know whether the child was adopted or not. But in most everyday social settings like parent-teacher meetings, hosting birthday parties, driving you to swimming lessons, an adoptive parent is just as much of a parent to that child as a biological parent. Now, if someone were to point their finger at them and said, "You are not a real parent, you didn't beget or bring forth offspring, you're nothing but a glorified kidnapper," then that person is not just being frankly an asshole, but also wrong. Also, biology is the nature of pronouns is such an odd argument to make. Like, when was the last time you checked someone else's chromosomes before talking to them? There is no biological textbook that will have a chapter on the differences between a he and a she. I feel like this argument can only be made in the context of English language. Love how transphobes like Ben Shapiro conveniently forgets that different languages with their own grammar exist. In Bengali, for example, which is my native language, there is no gendered third-person pronouns, just one gender-neutral pronoun that is used under all settings. In some languages, it is not just the pronouns that are gendered. Like in German, there are 3 types of grammatical articles: der, die, and das. Der being used for masculine nouns, die being used for feminine nouns, and das for neutral. Because all nouns are assigned a gender in German. A spoon is considered masculine, but a fork is feminine. A chair is masculine, but a table is feminine. Coffee is masculine, but a coffee machine is feminine. Alcohol of all sorts is masculine, except for beer, which is neuter. Because, German beer is so special, it just had to be an exception. Well, what now, Ben? What now? How do you use biology to accurately decipher the true gender identity of a teapot? Language is just a bunch of sounds coming out of your mouth. And like I said, since most trans women live their lives as women, they are also socially recognized by most people as women. I mean, if I were to point to someone who looks like this in a crowd and refer to them as a he, no one would know who I'm talking about. Most people subconsciously will refer to them as a she. It is dingbats like Ben Shapiro who has to make a constant effort to continue to misgender them.
The transgender woman from Orange is the New Black.
I never watched that show.
I've never watched that show either, but she's on the cover of Time magazine.
Oh.
Or he's on the cover of Time magazine.
Now, don't get it twisted. I'm not saying that you have to pass as a trans person for people to use your preferred pronouns. And obviously this discussion of pronouns extends to trans men and non-binary people as well. But I chose to focus more on trans women since this documentary and most of transphobia in general seems to be targeted towards them. But aside from transphobia, it is just basic social etiquette to refer to people by their chosen pronouns. Despite all the attack helicopter memes that trans and non-binary people have been caricatured down to, most non-binary people that I know of are completely fine with people asking for their pronouns, or even some accidental misgendering here and there. But if you're intentionally choosing to use the wrong pronouns, then I'm sorry, but you're being an asshole. It's like if Matt Walsh were to come up to me and introduce himself as Matt, and I responded with, "Your name is not Matt, you look like a John to me. I'm gonna keep calling you John regardless of what name you go by." 5. Think of the children. The last portion of the documentary is just, think of the children. How am I going to explain this to my child? They present this movement of trans rights and gender awareness as simply a trend, or worse, a social contagion.
The whole idea of social contagion, that there could be something in one's social environment that could play some role.
Trans is very cool. Trans is a way of giving yourself value, given the way society at the moment is functioning.
Which, firstly, it is literally the exact same argument that Hitler made against homosexuals, but okay. Secondly, the documentary doesn't cite any research supporting this. Instead, they just show a montage of LGBT plus representation in the media and a bunch of queer influencers with ominous editing and scary music. I don't feel comfortable showing any of that because a lot of those people shown are minors who likely didn't consent to any of this. But in terms of actual research, the medical term for the phenomena that they are describing is called rapid onset gender dysphoria, where children believe that they are trans due to social influence, trauma, and other mental illnesses manifesting as this false sense of gender dysphoria. The only paper that somewhat proves this has been debunked long ago, and currently there is no other evidence supporting this. The paper, published in 2018, does not even include any trans or gender non-conforming children in their study. Rather, they survey the parents of these children who were recruited from transphobic websites. I wonder why most parents think it's sudden and surprising when their kids come out as trans. I wonder why most queer kids make friends with each other. The study pretty much goes like, what is it like being trans? We asked some transphobes. I mean, the idea that seeing trans representation in the media is going to encourage more children to be trans sounds awful lot like the argument of video games cause people to be more violent, which we know is bullshit. Maybe it is not these queer kids or the LGBT plus community as a whole persuading children, but rather your child likely had a lot of these ideas in their head to begin with, and being around people who are more accepting and open-minded about these things finally allowed them to verbalize their thoughts and be their true self. But people like Matt Walsh aren't even supportive of heterosexual sex education, so same-sex education is maybe a bit too much to ask for.
It's perfectly normal for 10 years and up. Here's just one page I want you to see here.
For 10 and up, huh?
It's unspeakable what these people have done to our children.
Now, I actually looked up this book myself, and it honestly is not that bad. It goes into the details of the birds and bees, puberty, family planning, and does so in a very sex-positive manner without projecting any guilt or shame. I mean, if it was intended for 3 or 5-year-olds, then yeah, I would say that's a little weird and maybe inappropriate even, but it is intended for age 10 and up, around the age where most people hit puberty and should learn and know about these things. I mean, hopefully I don't need to get into the importance of having proper sex education in school, but even personally, I grew up knowing a lot of girls from very religious and conservative households who were never taught anything about sex, puberty, getting periods even. So when it finally happened, it was a traumatic experience as they didn't know what to expect. Having access to proper education, especially in formal books like It's Perfectly Normal that tries to destigmatize these topics, would have been a godsend for those girls, and for me even for that matter. I guess all of this boils down to the idea that Children are impressionable and shouldn't have agency of themselves, and their innocence must be protected and preserved. Throughout the documentary, Matt Walsh keeps pointing out how kids have such an active imagination. How could they even know if they're trans when they still believe that Santa Claus is real?
Have you ever met a 4-year-old who believes in Santa Claus?
Which, firstly, a kid believing in Santa Claus is not the same as a kid thinking they're trans, and trying to equate the two is just arguing in bad faith. While I'm not denying that kids are impressionable and need to be protected, giving them no agency for themselves is dangerous and can lead to a lot of parents abusing their power, especially for things like medical consent. In some countries like the UK and Australia, you can consent at the age of 16 or even 14, provided that you're deemed mature and competent enough. In the case for trans children, every child's experience is going to be unique and need to be decided on an individual case-by-case basis. Some kids know at a very young age that they're trans and show obvious signs of dysphoria. Some come to this realization when they hit puberty, and some may even try to transition and realize that it is not for them and go back to living the way that they were used to before. This article by The Atlantic explores this topic with depth and nuance. But overall, there is strong evidence that children who believe that they are trans show a significant improvement in their health and well-being when they're allowed to transition, substantially reducing their risk of suicidal ideation, with the rate of detransitioning being extremely low. So if your child believes that they may be trans, there is a good chance that they are and should be listened to, especially when the risk of suicidal ideation is likely to increase significantly when trans children are denied appropriate treatment. Even if your kids are not trans, chances are that in their lifetime they are likely to come across a trans or a gender non-conforming person at some point, so they need to know how to interact with them in a respectful manner. Our kids are not going to stay kids forever. So even if learning about these topics may feel uncomfortable or inappropriate even, it is important. But if somewhere along the line, if your child decides that they're not really trans, that is fine too. Because unlike what many of these conservative news outlets will want you to believe, transitioning is really not as scary as it may seem. 6. Gender-Affirming Procedures. The documentary largely focuses on puberty blockers as one of the methods of transitioning, but in this section I will briefly touch on other procedures like hormone replacement therapy and gender reassignment surgeries. They present this statistic that 90% of children who just go through a normal puberty would be fine and overcome gender dysphoria.
The vast majority, up to 90% of kids, if they go through a normal puberty, they're going to be okay. They will be at peace with their bodies, and they will have avoided dangerous and experimental medical interventions and surgeries.
Now, I will give them that they are correct in a sense that 80 to 90% of children overcome gender dysphoria, but that data comes from a study of prepubescent children and states that if gender dysphoria persists into early puberty, it is almost certainly permanent. Furthermore, what the documentary fails to mention is that those prepubescent children are not being medically transitioned through puberty blockers or all these dangerous experimental medical interventions and surgeries. Rather, it is mostly social transitioning that is implemented for children who haven't hit puberty yet, i.e. living in a way that affirms your gender. I mean, think about it. How are you going to prescribe puberty blockers to a child who hasn't even hit puberty yet? Like, what are you blocking against? For most of those kids who go back to living the way they used to, there is no medication involved, and I personally don't see anything wrong with that aside from the intense levels of bullying and harassment those children may face at schools. But despite the risk of suicide, disproportionately high levels of bullying and harassment, there is still an overwhelming amount of research that showed that sex reassignment surgeries and other forms of transitions yields to long-term mental health benefits among trans people. I find it interesting how They accuse the medical professionals who point out the risk of increased suicidal ideation when denied treatment to trans people as emotionally blackmailing.
And they say, what would you rather have? A living daughter or a dead son? If this is what the professionals are saying, it's terrible emotional blackmail.
But literally, this entire section of the documentary have been nothing but emotive. It is very deceptively edited with tense music and dark lighting. They have been using graphic language to describe these treatments, use of words like dangerous, experimental.
How can they be removing the healthy breasts of 15-year-old girls?
The way these people talk about medical transitioning as if it is such an easy process, like you can just walk into a gender clinic and walk out with your tits cut off. No, that is really not how it works. There are thorough, rigorous evaluations, medical and psychological examinations that you have to go through. You have to spend a significant period of time living in a way that affirms your gender, i.e. social transitioning, before you can even get prescribed hormones. On top of that, there is an extremely long wait list that you have to go through. Get approval from not just your doctors, parents, but even the court just to get puberty blockers if you're under 16, which is exactly what happened in the UK, which has only been recently overturned. Furthermore, this medical gatekeeping is only getting more and more robust, thanks to people like Matt Walsh spreading misinformation about this process. Even just talking to individual trans people, you'll find out that this process is anything but easy. The point I'm trying to make is that for most trans people who choose to medically transition, gender reassignment surgery is usually the last step. There are extremely rare cases where they would go straight into surgeries without being on hormones, puberty blockers, living as their chosen gender for a certain period of time. If there are already so many hurdles in their way of just receiving hormones and puberty blockers, how much harder do you think it will be to get surgeries? There is a worry of detransitioning, and the documentary again takes a very emotive approach by presenting this one case, but like I've already mentioned, the actual rate of detransitioning is extremely low. Even then, if you're worried about people regretting their surgeries and changing their minds later, your approach shouldn't be more robust medical gatekeeping. It should be more lenient instead, so that people are allowed to experiment safely with procedures that are less permanent, like hormones and puberty blockers, which are a lot easier to reverse. You should be more accepting of trans people that do not pass strictly, so that they do not feel pressured to get surgeries just to feel accepted in society. You can't be out here making fun of gender non-conforming people and trans people who do not pass, while at the same time condemn them for detransitioning. The documentary then goes on to spread more misinformation, this time about puberty blockers.
Hormones that have never been used in this way in the field of medicine.
So this generation, they're the lab rats.
That is completely false. Cis children have been prescribed puberty blockers to treat a condition called precocious puberty, where you hit puberty earlier than what is considered to be normal. In some rare cases, especially among girls, there would be children as young as 4 or 5 who would be starting puberty, which is obviously not healthy. And puberty blockers can either put a pause to that or slow down that process. It is literally the exact same process for trans children. In fact, they're prescribed the exact same medication at exact same doses, which are FDA approved, well studied, well documented, completely reversible, and have been used for decades.
We have no research on long-term hormone use.
One of the side effects of puberty blockers is that it can lower your bone mineral density, which this documentary again addressed in a very emotive manner.
I just spoke a month or two ago with a mother whose 14-year-old daughter was put on blockers. They discovered after 2 years, this 14-year-old girl has osteoporosis. That's something that like old women get.
Now, there are some research that suggests that puberty blockers can lead to lowering your bone density. However, this is not a puberty blocker specific thing, but rather absence of puberty that can cause this, which is considered to be normal. This one study in particular tested this among young girls, and as you can see, girls that hit puberty on the late onset had lower bone density. This can easily be prevented or managed through the regular checkup with your doctor, which you're supposed to do when you're taking hormones anyway. I guess when people say these medications have never been used this way before, they mean in the context of transitioning to a different gender than the one that you were assigned at birth. But here's the thing, these are not meant to be trans medication or sex change medication, they are just medication which function to either increase or decrease the production of some hormones in your body that can be used under numerous contexts. Transitioning is just one of them. Same goes for hormone replacement therapy, which someone like Joe Rogan takes for performance enhancements. The documentary tries to paint this picture of these medications being so horrible, like these are used to treat cancer patients and sex offenders. But it really is just guilt by association. What they're really trying to do is present a rational argument to hide the underlying fear. 7. Fear-mongering. The documentary constantly reminds you at every minute that what they're doing is so controversial, provocative. They don't want you to know about this.
They've made it pretty clear that if you speak up about it and you say anything negative, that your life will be over in some way.
You step wrong as the therapist, you say the wrong thing once and your bloody career is over.
There are forces that don't want this information out.
Which can be refuted so easily just by looking at their YouTube channels. Matt Walsh and all of his collaborators have a huge platform on YouTube, some sitting at over 1 million subscribers. The documentary itself has really good ratings despite all the issues I mentioned with it. At one point, Matt Walsh goes up to this panel of people that were never mentioned before and gives this big heroic speech where he pretty much tells them to go F themselves. You know, like people with limited freedom of speech do. But oh no, they made him wear a mask during his speech. Now that is a clear infringement of rights.
They tried to muzzle me by not allowing me to speak. And when that didn't work, they tried to muzzle me with a mask.
But on a serious note, usually when free speech advocates point to the use of pronouns as an infringement of their First Amendment, what they refer to is this Canadian legislation called Bill C-16, which was popularized by Jordan Peterson. However, if you actually read through Bill C-16, it doesn't say anything about pronouns, it doesn't even mention the word pronoun anywhere. It's just an extension of the Human Rights and Criminal Code to include gender identity and expression. Furthermore, the bill clearly states that it has to be evident that the offense was motivated by bias, prejudice, or hatred towards a protected group. In case of pronouns, the misuse of pronouns on their own is not considered a criminal act. What I'm trying to get at is the way a lot of these conservatives talk about legislations like Bill C-16 as if you misgender someone just once and it could land you in jail. But in reality, there is more to that. Usually the people who have been penalized have done way more than just misgendering someone. Like the supposed father that Matt Walsh interviews via phone, who allegedly were arrested and fined for just misgendering his son. Which, firstly, the fact that this was conducted via phone is already a little suspicious to me, especially in a documentary where the whole premise is Matt Walsh going out and about and interviewing people in person. But even just by listening to their conversation, you can tell that the father is incredibly controlling and has already made their mind that their child is not trans and was not going to listen to anyone telling him otherwise. They gave him several chances to mend things with his son, yet he put his own moral convictions first. Although he was kept anonymous for this interview, I found this article that reported a very similar incident that also happened in the exact same location that this father is from, and according to this article, he kept violating the court order by going public about his son's transition. His actions have caused a lot of distress to his son, who was already going through a lot. I fully understand how some parents may feel reluctant to go forward with the transition of their child. It can be scary and overwhelming. But regardless of what you think or feel about this whole trans thing, I hope we can all unanimously agree that we want our children to be happy and healthy. And the biggest predictor for the well-being of trans children is not having access to hormones, surgeries, or even puberty blockers. It is parental support. I mean, just look at this graph. The data here is as clear as day. And we finally made it to the end of this documentary. The credits roll over showing that it is directed by Justin Folk. I was kind of interested to see what kind of other stuff he has directed before. No safe spaces. They put duct tape on the Statue of Liberty because, get it, they're trying to silence you. We've got What is a Woman? No safe spaces. The Adventures of Megabyte. Wait, what? It's a superhero movie. How did you go from making superhero movies to this? So, what is a woman? All this talk about trans issues, and we haven't even gotten around to answering the question yet. You know, the one that this documentary was supposed to find. You might be wondering, does Matt Walsh at some point answer this question? No. If you look around the internet for anything related to this documentary, you'll soon find a lot of comments saying how, oh, these people are so stupid, they can't even answer such a simple question. But I bet if you were to answer these people the exact same question, they would not be able to provide an answer themselves that includes both the biological and the social aspects of being a woman without being exclusionary in some way. Part of the reason is because woman is a noun, and nouns are pretty hard to define. Try defining any other nouns like an apple, a tree, a chair, or even the antithesis of Matt Walsh's question, what is a man? If I were to ask you what is a man, at first it may sound like a relatively simple question, but soon you'll realize that it is pretty difficult to come up with a definition that encapsulates both the social and biological aspects of being a man. At best, we may come up with a list of traits like being assigned male at birth, having XY chromosomes, maybe having some secondary sex characteristics like facial hair and a lower voice. But hang on, we know there are trans men who were assigned female at birth, but they lived their lives and experienced their lives as men. There are men who suffer from Klinefelter syndrome, where they were born with 2 X and 1 Y chromosome, and I'm sure we can all think of some men who can't grow facial hair, or men who have a high-pitched voice. And that is not even going into the social aspects of being a man, which is going to vary from person to person, culture to culture, and different time periods throughout history. In some places like Korea, it is typical for men to wear makeup. At some point in history, high heels were worn by men. Therefore, there is no one answer, and that is the nature of sociological or humanities fields of studies. You are unlikely to find a single straight answer to your question, and that is fine. There are just some things in life that you can't really prove rationally. Can you rationally prove why you love the people you love? Is there a rule, a mathematical formula proving your love for your children? No. And trying to come up with one would be absurd and dehumanizing in a lot of ways. Maybe gender identity is just one of those things. How do you know whether you're a man or a woman? You just are. But who am I kidding? Because we know Matt Walsh isn't really here to learn. If he did, he would actually listen to some of these people he interviewed and not cut them off. This stage pursuit of wanting to learn what is a woman was really disguised as a ploy for him to shit on trans women. And I mean, that is fine. I obviously am not okay with it, but you know, he has the freedom of speech to do that. But I would much rather have him just do that instead of putting up a charade of being on the pursuit, the journey of finding the truth. It is important to note that a lot of the people that this documentary feature, whose views conveniently align with Matt Walsh's pre-existing beliefs, have affiliations with him in some way or another. Miriam Grossman, for instance, the doctor that was interviewed, have written for Breitbart, which is another conservative publication website. Deborah So, the former academic that was featured, has been a featured guest on Ben Shapiro's shows and has appeared on Joe Rogan's podcast before. Basically, they all have major conflicts of interest. Just to hone in on the fact that this documentary is really not as objective and unbiased as they make it out to be. If you were to actually look up some of the things mentioned, you would find similar things to what I found. On that note, I would like to thank all these wonderful trans creators who have made researching for this video a hell of a lot easier. I will have all my sources linked below in a Google Doc if you'd like more detailed analysis on any of the topics I covered in this video. There are plenty of content made by these creators that you can check out. Finally, I would like to point out that although in this video I joked around a bit, try to keep things lighthearted, but for a lot of trans people, this is a serious issue. I wouldn't be surprised if a couple of years from now, the points made in this abomination of a documentary were still being used against trans people. Even though we as a society have made significant progress towards the acceptance of same-sex attraction, trans and other genderqueer identities seem to be lagging behind. There are plenty of research suggesting that trans people are much less favored in comparison to other queer identities. But I like to think of myself to be generally an optimist. I don't think most people are raging transphobes like Matt Walsh, but rather they simply don't understand. Trans is still a relatively new thing for a lot of people. Hopefully this video provided some clarity. However, if you're at the stage where you're paying a monthly subscription to the Daily Wire, you are probably a bit too far gone. But there is still hope. I mean, on Pride Month this year, Fox News actually featured a trans teenager in one of their news segments. And it's not in the way you would think. He wasn't misgendered, he wasn't ridiculed, he was actually presented very respectfully. Matt Walsh threw a fit on Twitter after seeing this. Imagine being so devolved that Fox News is more progressive than you. This video has been kind of heavy, so I thought I would end it on a high by playing you some of it, because there was still light at the end of the tunnel.
14-year-old Ryland Whittington is a typical Southern California teenager. And the Whittingtons, along with mom Hillary, dad Jeff, and sister Brinley, are a typical family. The only difference, though, in Ryland's eyes, is what this family can mean to the tens of thousands of kids under 18 who identify as transgender.
We put our story out there so people could see that there's another family out there that is going through what we're going through.
I could just see that it wasn't him trying to be a brat. It was painful. It was truly painful for him to have to wear feminine clothing and for us constantly telling him that you're a girl.
And unlike some trans kids, when Ryland came out at age 5 a few years later, he had the full support of his parents.
For me, it's just a deep spiritual belief that you believe in God and he, created us the way he wanted us. Well, then yes, he created Ryland just the way he is. I'd rather have a living son than a dead daughter. And I guarantee that if we had pushed back and done what a lot of parents do, I don't think that we would have either one of the kids that you see before you here today.
Allowing him to live authentically and true to himself and be who he really feels like he is.
The Whittingtons believe sharing their story could make a lasting difference in another child's life.
You might be struggling right now, but we believe in you, this family. We might not know you, we might not know where you live, but we understand you and we believe in you.
What extraordinary courage displayed by Ryland, his mother Hillary, father Jeff, and sister Brinley. I want to thank the Whittington family for speaking to us. It's not easy, particularly when transgender issues have been so politicized. People are afraid of what they often do not understand.